How does a civilization define itself? Through its art, its wars, its politics. For the entire Western world, the answer for over 2 millennia has been simpler and far more profound. It has defined itself through the ideas of one man. A man born into wealth and turmoil, who witnessed the death of his world and the death of his mentor. From that fire, he forged a new way of thinking that would shape history forever. This isn't just the story of Plato the philosopher. This is the story of Plato the man, and how his response to a personal and civic trauma laid the foundation for the next 2,000 years of Western thought. What kind of world could forge such a monumental intellect? The answer lies in a city of both genius and chaos, Athens. It's the turbulent world of Athens. To understand Plato, you first have to understand the world that made him. Plato was born sometime around 428 BCE into the heart of a paradox. Athens was in its so-called Golden Age, a beacon of culture, art, and the world's first radical experiment in democracy. But that gold was starting to tarnish. Plato was born into the highest level of Athenian aristocracy. His family tree wasn't just respected, it was legendary, tracing back to the great lawgiver Solon, one of the founders of Athenian democracy itself. Politics was in his blood. His relatives, like his uncle Charmides and his mother's cousin Cretias, were major players in the city. For a young man with his family connections and obvious talent, a glittering political career wasn't just an option. It was an expectation. But the Athens of Plato's youth was a city tearing itself apart. The devastating Peloponnesian War against its arch-rival, Sparta, had been raging for years. This wasn't some distant conflict. It was a brutal, generation-defining struggle that brought plague, hardship, and a gnawing uncertainty to the city. Tano grew up watching the Athenian war machine falter, seeing the cracks appear in the great democratic project. He saw how mass decisions, swayed by powerful speakers and popular opinion, could lead to disastrous military campaigns. This aristocratic young man, raised on tales of honorable governance, was getting a front-row seat to the potential chaos of mob rule. The breaking point came in 404 BCE, and exhausted and broken Athens finally surrendered to Sparta. The democracy was dismantled, and a new, brutal oligarchic regime was installed, a government that would become infamous as the 30 Tyrants. And here, Plato's personal world and the political world collided. The leaders of this coup included his own relatives, Cretias and Charmides. They invited Plato to join them, to help set the city back onto the path of justice. He was tempted at first, hoping for a return to a more stable, virtuous order. But he was quickly horrified. The 30 tyrants unleashed a reign of terror, executing their political opponents and seizing property. Plato was disgusted by their savagery. This was not the noble rule he had imagined. The tyrants' rule was short-lived, and democracy was restored a year later. But Plato's faith in existing political systems was shattered. First, he'd seen the chaos of democracy, and now, the viciousness of oligarchy. He was adrift, a man of immense talent, in a world where every political path seemed corrupt. But it was in this state of disillusionment that he'd already found an anchor, a man who offered a completely different way. Strange, stone-faced man who wandered the streets of Athens, asking questions that would change Plato's life, and ultimately the world. His name was Socrates. The shadow of Socrates. The turning point. Socrates was unlike anyone in Athens. He wasn't a politician or a general. He wrote nothing down. His entire philosophy was lived out in the open, in the public square. He would approach the most powerful and supposedly wisest men of Athens, the generals, politicians, and poets, and, through a relentless style of questioning, he would reveal a humbling truth. They didn't really know what they claimed to know. For a young Plato, disillusioned with the political game swirling around him, Socrates was a revelation. Here was a man who wasn't concerned with power or wealth, but with truth, virtue, and the state of one's soul. Plato became his devoted follower, absorbing his mentor's methods and his relentless search for real knowledge. But Socrates' methods made him dangerous. By exposing the ignorance of the Athenian elite, he made powerful enemies. To the establishment, he was a disruptive force, a gadfly as he called himself, stinging the great horse of the state into action. To the anxious parents of Athens, he was a corrupting influence, teaching their sons to question authority. In 399 BCE, the restored democracy decided to swat the gadfly. Socrates was put on trial. The official charges were impiety, failing to recognize the city's gods, and corrupting the youth. But these were likely trumped-up charges. A convenient way to silence a man who had become associated with critics of the democracy. The trial was a spectacle. Before a jury of 501 citizens, Socrates didn't mount a defense so much as a defiance. As recorded in Plato's Apology, Socrates refused to beg or flatter. Instead, he doubled down, arguing his questioning was a divine mission, a service to the state, and that far from being punished, he ought to be rewarded. The jury, by a narrow margin, found him guilty. When it was time to propose a penalty, Socrates sarcastically suggested he be given free meals for life at public expense. The enraged jury then voted overwhelmingly for the prosecution's recommendation: death. For Plato, who was at the trial, this was the ultimate cataclysm, was the final, unforgivable proof that the systems of men were broken. A democracy, a system of the people, had just voted to execute its wisest and most virtuous citizen. The very state his ancestors had helped build had committed an act of philosophical murder. This event extinguished any last flicker of political ambition in Plato's heart. He now saw that the problem wasn't just about choosing between democracy or oligarchy. The entire foundation was rotten. The world didn't need a new politician. It needed a new kind of knowledge. Disgusted and heartbroken, Plato left Athens. His political career was over, but his true life's work was just beginning. The journey for knowledge. After the execution of his master, Plato left Athens for over a decade. It was part self-imposed exile, part intellectual pilgrimage. He was searching for answers that he could no longer find at home. His travels took him across the Mediterranean, and each stop added a new layer to his thinking. He journeyed to Egypt, a civilization of incredible antiquity and stability. While details are sparse, it's believed he studied with priests and scholars, observing a society built on ancient tradition, a stark contrast to the volatile politics of Athens. Even more important was his time in southern Italy. There he met the followers of Pythagoras, the mystic mathematician. The Pythagoreans were a fascinating mix of a scientific community and a religious cult. They believed that reality, at its deepest level, was mathematical. They saw numbers not just as tools for counting, but as the fundamental principles of the universe. This idea electrified Plato. It suggested that beneath the messy, ever-changing world we see with our senses, there lies a hidden, perfect, and eternal order you could access, not with your eyes, but with your mind. Wow! This was a pivotal moment, planting the seeds for what would become his most famous idea. His travels also took him to Sicily in the court of a powerful tyrant, Dionysius, the first of Syracuse. Here, Plato made his first attempt to put philosophy into practice. He befriended the tyrant's brother-in-law Dion and dreamed of molding the ruler into a true philosopher-king. It was a disaster. The paranoid Dionysius grew to resent Plato's influence. The story that has come down to us is a dark one. The tyrant, angered by the philosopher's lessons on justice, had Plato sold into slavery. He was eventually ransomed by a friend and sent back to Athens. This harrowing experience taught Plato a hard lesson. It wasn't enough to simply have knowledge. Power in the hands of the unenlightened will always resist reason. You couldn't just find one wise individual. You had to create an entire system to nurture and protect wisdom. Around 387 BCE, at 40 years old, Plato returned to Athens. He was no longer the disillusioned youth who had fled the city. He was a man who had seen the world, studied with mystics and mathematicians, and tried to advise kings. He had gathered all the ingredients he needed. Now, it was time to build something entirely new. He purchased a plot of land in a grove just outside the city walls, a park sacred to a hero named Academus. And there, he founded a school that would change the world, the Academy, a revolution in thought. What Plato founded was nothing short of revolutionary. We often call it the first university in the Western world, the blueprint for higher learning. But calling it just a school misses its radical purpose. The Academy wasn't a place for simply memorizing facts. It was an intellectual laboratory designed to produce a new kind of human being. The name, the Academy, came from the grove, where it was located, a calm space, away from the political chaos of the city, a place for reflection and deep conversation. And unlike the other teachers of the day, the sophists charged huge fees to teach public speaking for political gain. Plato's Academy was a community of thinkers dedicated to a common search for truth. The curriculum was vast, covering philosophy, astronomy, biology, and other sciences. But at its heart was mathematics. An inscription supposedly hung over the entrance: "Let no one ignorant of geometry enter here." For Plato, math was the essential training for the philosophical mind. It taught students to look beyond the messy physical world to a higher realm of perfect, unchanging principles, the pure reality of numbers and shapes. It was the gateway to a deeper reality. The main teaching method wasn't the lecture, but dialectica, rigorous, collaborative form of question and answer. This was the Socratic method, turned into an institution. Students weren't there to be filled with facts, but to have their own ideas tested and their assumptions challenged. Plato would pose a problem, and together teachers and students would work through it, dissecting arguments and searching for logical flaws. The goal wasn't to win a debate, but to collectively turn the soul away from the shadows of mere opinion and towards the light of real knowledge. The Academy attracted the brightest minds from all over the Greek world. For 20 years, its most famous student was a young man from Stagira named Aristotle, whom Plato reportedly called the mind of the school. It was a vibrant hub of research. They didn't just discuss old ideas, they created new ones, engaging in cutting-edge mathematical research to understand the rational order of the cosmos. But the ultimate goal of the Academy was political, born from the trauma of Socrates' death. It was designed to create the one thing Plato believed could save society: a class of leaders, whose minds were so thoroughly trained in reason that they could govern with true wisdom. The Academy wasn't just an academic retreat. It was the training ground for the philosopher king, Plato's legacy, the world of ideas. Everything Plato lived through: the political failure in Athens, Socrates' death, the mystical math of the Pythagoreans, the founding of his academy, all of it culminated in his philosophy. Preserved in a series of brilliant dialogues, his ideas completely reframed reality, politics, and the human soul. The core of his philosophy is the theory of forms. Plato argued that the world we see with our senses isn't the real world. It's a flickering, imperfect copy, like shadows on a cave wall. Beyond this physical realm, he said, there exists a higher world of perfect, eternal, and unchanging forms or ideas. There's a perfect form of a circle, and all the circles we draw are just flawed imitations. More importantly, there are forms for concepts: a perfect form of justice, a perfect form of courage, and above all, a supreme, illuminating form of the good. This is true reality, and it can only be grasped by the mind through reason. To explain this, Plato gave us one of history's most powerful metaphors: the allegory of the cave. He asks us to imagine prisoners chained in a cave their whole lives, facing a blank wall. Behind them a fire burns, and puppeteers cast shadows on the wall. For the prisoners, these shadows are reality. Now, imagine one prisoner is freed. He's forced to turn and see the fire and the puppets, a painful, confusing new reality. Then, he's dragged out of the cave into the blinding sun. At first he sees nothing, but as his eyes adjust, he sees the real world. He finally understands the shadows were just pale imitations. That journey out of the cave, for Plato, is education. The philosopher is the freed prisoner who has seen the true world of the forms, lit by the form of the good. Then his duty is to go back into the cave to try and enlighten the others, even if they mock him, or as, with Socrates, try to kill him. This theory directly shaped his political masterpiece, the Republic. As a direct response to the democracy that killed Socrates, Plato designed an ideal state. This state would be built on justice, which he defined as harmony. Society would have three classes, corresponding to the parts of the soul: the producers, the soldiers, and the guardians. And ruling over it all would be the philosopher king. This ruler wouldn't be a tyrant hungry for power. In fact, a true philosopher would have no desire to rule. It would only do it out of a sense of duty. After decades of training at a place like the Academy, Their mind would be fixed on the eternal forms of justice and goodness. They alone would be qualified to govern, free from greed and ego, making decisions based on pure knowledge for the good of the entire state. This was Plato's ultimate answer to the execution of Socrates. Conclusion: the enduring influence. Plato's journey was immense. He started as a young man destined for politics, was shattered by the death of his mentor, wandered the world searching for wisdom, and returned to found an institution that would define education itself. From a disillusioned youth, he became the father of Western philosophy. The sheer scope of his thought is staggering, laying the groundwork for metaphysics, ethics, political theory, and psychology. His legacy isn't a set of dusty doctrines, but a way of thinking. The process of questioning, reasoning, and seeking truth remains the cornerstone of philosophy. Every time a student is asked not what to think, but how to think, Plato's spirit is there. The Academy itself lasted for nearly 900 years, an incredible run that cemented its influence on Roman, Islamic, and Christian thought. Its most famous student, Aristotle, would go on to critique and build upon his master's ideas, creating his own monumental system. In fact, the 20th century philosopher Alfred North Whitehead famously said that the entire European philosophical tradition consists of a series of footnotes to Plato. His ideas are still fiercely debated. Is his vision of a philosopher king a blueprint for wise leadership, or a dangerous justification for elitist rule? Is the world of forms a profound insight into reality, or a dismissal of the beauty of our own physical world? The fact that we still ask these questions, that we still grapple with the problems Plato laid out 2,400 years ago, is the ultimate testament to his power. He set out to create a world that would be safe for Socrates. He may have failed to build that physical utopia, but he succeeded in building something far more lasting, an empire of the mind. He gave us a new language to talk about justice, truth, and reality, and left behind a legacy of inquiry that has shaped every one of us, whether we know it or not. What do you think? Is Plato's vision of a society ruled by experts the answer to our modern political problems? Or is it a dangerous fantasy? Hey, let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you want to keep exploring the great minds who shaped our world, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell.